Don't take me back.
Wasn't planning to.
You lie.
If I fall, you crawl.
If you fall, I stand. That's not the plan.
Then make a better one.
New Mexico Territory, Red Willow Basin. Late dry season 1883. The wind crossed the basin like a creature that had forgotten how to hurry. It carried dust and the faint taste of iron slipping through the cracked earth and into the seams of an old cabin crouched against the slope. The sun was breaking apart behind the mesa, a red coin melting into stone, and Elias Mercer stood out there, sleeves rolled, a hammer still in his hand. He was listening, not to the wind or the dry grass whispering, but to something under it, a sound that didn't belong, a ragged breath. A human one. Elias dropped the hammer, moved toward the ridge. Years in the cavalry had taught him that sound carries truer through still air. Each step broke thin crusts of dust, and his shadow stretched long behind him, sharp enough to look like someone else walking. The sound wasn't alone. Through the haze, he saw 3 riders in the basin circling something bound in the dust. A woman on her knees, arms tied, head bowed against the glare. One man lifted his rifle like he meant to finish a chore. Elias didn't think, just aimed high and fired. The crack split the air. The horses, spooked, bolted toward the ridge. By the time the dust cleared, only the woman was left struggling against the rope. He ran down the slope after her. The sound came again, a broken gasp, this time from the low hollow near the dry creek. He found her there. A woman lay face down in the dirt, her wrists tied and front rope thick and fresh. Her dress, deerskin torn at the shoulder, was stiff with blood. Her feet were scraped raw, one ankle still bleeding. Her hair, black and tangled, clung to her cheek in thin ribbons. Elias knelt, cutting the rope with the edge of his knife. The moment the rope snapped, she stirred. Her eyes opened halfway, dark, unfocused, and then suddenly there was steel flashing between them. A blade, small, handmade. She slashed upward on instinct. He leaned aside just in time. The knife tore a line across his collar instead of his throat. "Easy," he said, voice low and even. "I'm not them." She crouched, still shaking, knife tight in both hands. Her breathing was shallow, her words cut like broken stones. "Don't take me back." Elias raised both hands. Wasn't planning to. For a long moment, neither moved. Then her body gave way, pain, exhaustion, maybe disbelief, and she sagged sideways. He caught her before her head struck the ground. The heat of her skin was wrong, fever high, and the rope had chewed her wrists down to raw flesh. He looked around. Horse tracks. 3 sets. Fresh, heavy-headed east. Whoever had done this hadn't gone far. He lifted her. She was lighter than she looked, a small weight full of fight. He carried her across the basin, over the broken fence, and toward the shack that passed for home. The cabin creaked when he opened the door. Inside smelled of pine smoke and quiet. He laid her on the cot, poured water into a tin cup, and set it beside her hand. No reaction. He lit the stove, coaxing a thin flame from a stub of kindling. When he turned back, half the water was gone. Her eyes were open, now fixed on the fire, not on him. "I'm Elias Mercer," he said finally, because silence weighed too much. "Nothing." He pointed at her shoulder where blood had crusted in a dark half circle. "You'll lose that arm if I don't clean it." Her gaze flicked to the knife in his hand. He placed it flat on the floor between them, palm open. She hesitated, then nodded once, small, reluctant, but yes. The wound had a through and through path. The entry clean, the exit ragged. Whoever shot her had done it from behind, close range, a hunting rifle by the look of the tear. He cleaned it with boiled water and a strip torn from his shirt. She didn't cry out, didn't even flinch. When it was done, he tied the bandage over her shoulder, knotting it beneath her arm. "They shot you running," he said. She stared into the fire. "I ran." Her English was halting, shaped by another tongue. "They said, 'Shame.' I said no." The words hung in the air between them, simple, final. Elias didn't ask more. Some stories tell themselves loud enough in the eyes. Outside, the wind rose, dragging grit across the shutters. He glanced toward the sound. For a heartbeat, a shape moved along the ridge. A rider, maybe, or just the wind, stacking dust into ghosts. He shut the door and slid the bar across. There's food, he said, nodding toward the shelf. Not much. Beans and salt. You can eat or not. I'll take the porch tonight. Her eyes lifted, cautious, but alive now. You not send me away. Elias shook his head. I'm not sending anybody anywhere. He placed another log in the stove, the fireside light climbing her face, showing the faint bruise under her jaw, the tightness around her mouth, the look of someone who'd spent too long waiting for harm. When he turned to leave, she whispered almost to herself, Aiyana. He stopped. What, my name? She said, barely above a breath. Aiyana. He nodded once. All right, Aiyana. Outside night folded over the basin. The first star burned above the mesa, pale and lonely. Elias stepped onto the porch, leaned against the post, pulled his coat around him. The boards creaked under his boots, a sound too loud for the silence that followed. Then he heard it hooves. Far off at first, then closer, soft against the dry grass. 3 horses, maybe 4, keeping distance, moving slow. Not a passing herd. Not wild. Watching. He didn't reach for the rifle propped by the door. Not yet. Behind him, inside the cabin, the floor creaked. He turned. A sliver of firelight cut through the doorway. Aiyana stood there, hand on the latch, her shadow drawn tall against the wall. They're waiting, she said quietly. They don't leave. They wait. Elias met her gaze through the half-open door. Yeah, he said. Winds shifted. Means they'll come when it settles. Her eyes darted past him into the dark. The kind of looking that doesn't search, only measures what's coming. Lock the door, he told her. Sleep if you can. I'll keep watch. She didn't move right away. Instead, she reached out, resting her fingers against the doorframe, a gesture more ritual than fear, like she was touching the house to make it real. Then she nodded and closed the door. The latch fell into place with a dull wooden click, soft as a breath. Elias settled back under the eave. The stars wheeled slow above Red Willow Basin. Somewhere out there a horse snorted, and another voice, low, careless, laughed. Once then vanished into the wind. He waited. Inside, the fire dimmed to a red pulse behind the shutters. Outside, the dust began to rise again, not from wind this time, but from the steady, patient circling of hooves. That was how things started in the basin. Not with a shout, not with a bullet, with a breath caught and held too long in the dark. The wind eased sometime after midnight, as if it had said everything it meant to say. Elias stayed on the porch, back on the post, chin tucked into his collar. He had learned years ago that waiting is work, and you do it with your shoulders instead of your hands. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a horse stamped, then settled. Nothing else came. Near dawn, the stars thinned, and the basin changed color, dust gray to ash blue, then to that brittle silver that makes a man feel both awake and late. Elias straightened, rolled his neck, and listened to the cabin breathe. Aiyana had not cried, not once. He'd come to trust people who saved their breath for standing. He knocked once on the door with his knuckles soft. Coffee, he said the word, more steam than sound. He unbarred the door and stepped inside. The fire had slumped to a red coil. Aiyana sat upright on the cot blanket around her shoulders, hair braided in a rough line down her back. Her eyes flicked to his hands, to the rifle leaning by the jamb, to the tin cups on the shelf. She had inventoried the room in the night. Elias respected that. He set water to boil and measured coffee grounds with a pinch and a half. The smell climbed quick, full of dust and comfort. He poured a finger in each cup, left hers on the trunk within reach, and turned away to give her silence to decide. When he looked back, the level had dropped. You'll need food, he said, beans and fry bread. Won't win prizes, but it keeps a spine straight. Aiyana's mouth formed something near a smile, and then shut like it had remembered what the day was. She set the cup down gently, as if it might bruise. He checked the bandage. The wound had wept through the cloth in a thin, rust-colored crescent, but the fever fire in her skin had cooled by a shade. He mixed a paste of pinon sap and boiled water, spread it across a clean strip of shirt, and retied the dressing. She exhaled once through her nose, the sound a small surrender he pretended not to hear. Outside, the light climbed the planks of the door like a slow hand. Elias pushed it open with his shoulder. Fence needs looking, he said. If they come back, they'll start with the easy boards. Aiyana stood. The blanket slipped. She caught it with one hand, then set it aside. "I help," she said. "You don't have to." It came out more like a plea than he meant. She tilted her head, that measured look of hers, like she was weighing his reasons against the wind. "It keeps the hands from shaking," she said, and stepped past him into the morning. They walked the property line together, the grass whispering at their knees. Elias carried a handful of cut boards and an old hammer with a handle that had outlived two heads. Aiyana carried the box of bent nails he'd straightened by lantern light the previous winter, a slat of leather for a pad, and her quiet. At the north corner a post had bowed under last month's weather, and a long board had split along the grain. Elias braced it with his shoulder and set the new plank. "Hold that," he said. She pressed her palm against the wood elbow-locked jaw set. He hammered short, patient blows that kept the nails from bending, and the fence sang in the way fences do when they're becoming themselves again. Aiyana didn't flinch at the hammer's near miss. She watched his hands like a student watches a prayer. "You ever worked land?" he asked, because the quiet had started to feel like a third person. "My grandfather had fields," she said. "Corn that kept a family alive. I was small. I carried water." She looked down the fence line as if she could see that other field stitched into the dust. "They say I do not belong anywhere now." "People who say that usually want your legs to be theirs," Elias said. "They want the miles you'll travel to count for them." Her eyes cut to him. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't nothing. They made the turn by the dry creek. Half a mile along the sand told them what the air had hidden. Tracks. Not last night's. New ones crisp at the edges where the hooves had pressed, and the sun hadn't had time to blunt them. Heavy riders. One horse dragging something light, maybe rope, maybe a canvas roll. They'd come close to the well circled and left the way they'd come, a lazy arc like a question mark. Aiyana crouched, ran 2 fingers along a print. "They watched," she said. "Measured us," Elias answered, "counting the boards on our fence by the sound." "They come at night," she said. "Not fear. Logistics, most likely." She stood. The wind picked up, bringing the smell of the pines from higher ground. They both turned toward it without meaning to, and looked the way frightened. People don't long steady, unblinking. Back at the cabin, Elias split kindling, while Aiyana mended the warped water bucket with a wet rawhide thong and a dowel he whittled from a scrap. She soaked the thong until it softened, then pulled it through the crack, cinching it tight until the wood sighed back toward itself. He liked the way she handled tools, not like a borrowed language, but a second one. "You're English," he said at last. "Who taught it, mission woman?" she said, tightening the thong a final notch. "Long time ago. She taught words, not how to use them. You're doing fine." She shook her head, the ghost of a smile, this time less reluctant. "Words are for people who hear." He lifted a brow. "You think I don't?" She glanced at the ridge, then the door, then the ground. "You hear the wind," she said. Same thing. The shadows shortened. Heat crept. Elias stripped his coat and slung it over a peg. He was washing his hands in a shallow basin when the sound came, small but wrong, the scuff of a boot at the window that a coyote would never make. He dried without looking and walked to the wall where the rifle hung. "Inside," he said. Aiyana had already moved 1 step left into the narrow angle where the stove's iron belly blocked sightlines. No panic. She lifted her chin, found his eyes, and waited for the rest of the instruction. "Stay quiet. Boots on the porch now." Gentle, as if their owner had manners he wanted to try on for size. The knock that followed was soft. 3 raps. The same rhythm as the horses had made in the night. Elias didn't open. He let the knock land on wood and die its little death. "Farmer," a voice called. Easy drawl, too friendly. "Got a question for you." Aiyana's gaze slid to the rifle. He shook his head a fraction. "Wait. Trading post is all chatter," the voice went on. "Says you got company. Apache company. Thought I'd ask if that's the kind of company you mean to keep." Elias pictured the mouth that made that voice. He'd known too many of them to be wrong, the smile that didn't reach the eyes, the easy stance that only men with backup and coin afford themselves. "Doors closed," Elias said. "That means we're not in the asking mood." A small laugh. "Not cruel. Not kind." "Well now," the voice said. "If you see her, you let Sheriff Lyle know. He pays tidy for information, pays more for deliveries." The porch boards creaked. under a turning weight. Another step, a small scrape near the window. Aiyana's hand slid into her skirt and came out with that little knife again, blade catching the stove light, then vanishing in her palm. Silence. Then receding boots. A horse snorted. Hooves moved away down the yard, not fast, not slow. Elias let 3 breaths pass, then 4. He hung the rifle back and listened to the absence their leaving had made. It was louder than their coming. Aiyana uncoiled. "He comes back," she said. Less a prediction than a weather report. Yeah. Elias's mouth thinned. With the law or with friends? Maybe both. He walked to the shelf, reached under it, and pulled out a wooden box. Inside, a handful of cartridges, wrapped in cloth, an old revolver with a worn grip, a whetstone, the size of a man's tongue. He laid it all on the table and set the revolver in front of her butt first. "You ever shot one?" She looked at it the way she'd looked at the fence board, with exact attention. "Once," she said. "My uncle's hand on mine." Then we start there. He checked the cylinder, eased in rounds with a quiet click, and handed it over. "Elbow high. Breathe in. Sight, don't stare. And if your hands shake, let them. They'll learn you." He moved behind her to correct her grip, careful as a priest with fire. His chest brushed her shoulder, the uninjured one, and he felt the small stutter of her breath. Not fear. A rebalance like a rider meeting a fresh horse. Again he set his voice close to her ear. "Front sight, not the whole barrel." She aligned it along a knot in the wall, breathed, squeezed. The empty click made both of them flinch despite themselves. Elias smiled and hid it by turning away. They worked that way until the light shifted, and the stove heat became something a man notices. Each time the motion grew cleaner, the tremor shorter. He watched her find the part of herself that knew how to hold a line. When they stopped, he set the gun aside and poured more coffee, thin and bitter, but hot. Aiyana took hers with both hands and held it near her mouth, eyes on the window. The day had worn itself into gold, and the ridge burned at the edges. "They'll wait for dark," she said. "They will," Elias answered. "Men like that are brave in certain colors." She looked at him over the brim. "And you, I'm tired in all of them," he said, and that was as close as he could get to a truth he rarely told. He stood cross to the door and slid the bar into place before the last of the light fell. The room tightened around the stove's glow. He set a lantern on the table, but didn't light it. "On the floor by the door," he said, tugging a blanket down from the peg. "Me. Bed for you. That's how we keep the world where it belongs." Aiyana watched him for a heartbeat that felt like 2. She nodded, then reached for the blanket he offered. Their fingers touched in the handoff. Neither flinched. She lay on the cot, the revolver within reach but not clutched. He lay on the floor with his coat across his chest and the rifle beside him, the barrel turned away so it wouldn't read like a promise. For a long while they did nothing but breathe. The sound of it filled the room, equal to the fire's small ticking. Then from the yard, a soft scrape. Not boots this time. Leather on wood. Someone testing the latch from outside, with patience instead of force. Aiyana's hand found the revolver. Elias lifted the rifle without rising. The latch held. The scrape stopped. Silence fell again, dense and expectant. Elias didn't look at her, and she didn't look at him. They watched the door together like 2 people watching the same river decide if it would flood. The wind had returned to its old business, and the basin took one long breath. Somewhere in the dark a man laughed once low, and certain, as if he owned the sound. "They think we're soft," Aiyana whispered. Elias slid his palm against the floor until it touched the edge of her blanket. He didn't take her hand. He found the wood beneath warm where the stove had been busy, and pressed his hand there, solid, patient, as if he were holding the house itself in place. "Let 'em think it," he said. "It keeps them close." And then the knock came again, 3 slow raps, gentle as a teacher about to lie. Morning came without sound. The wind had gone, the kind of stillness that made even the stove creak too loud. Elias opened his eyes to a room of thin light dust, drifting like ash through the beam that slipped under the door. The air smelled of wood smoke, iron, and something new bred trying to happen. Aiyana was awake, kneeling by the hearth, stirring cornmeal in a dented pot. The blanket she'd slept under was folded tight beside her, untouched. She hadn't used it. Her back was straight, her hair tied with a strip of rawhide. Every movement she made looked like it belonged to a rule she hadn't forgotten. He cleared his throat. "You sleep, I watch the fire," she said. "That's not rest." It was enough. Elias poured coffee grounds into the tin pot and set it over the flame. When he handed her a cup, she didn't take it at first. He waited, and finally she reached out, holding it in both hands, like a promise she didn't know if she should make. "I'll be out fixing the east fence," he said. "Stay close to the door." Her eyes lifted briefly. "If I stay inside, I hear my blood too loud." He didn't argue. Sometimes work was the only prayer left. The land woke up slow. Dust shimmered off the basin floor, and the creek bed shone white and empty under the sun. Elias walked with his old shovel slung across one shoulder, boots biting the hard ground. Aiyana followed a few paces behind a coil of twine in her hand, her shadow thinner than her steps. At the fence line, he knelt to check a split board. "Hold that," he said. She pressed the plank steady while he hammered the nail through. Her wrists were still wrapped, but she didn't flinch at the vibration. When she looked down the line of posts, the desert stretched until it forgot itself, all light and mirage, and no memory of water. "You built all this alone?" she asked. "Wasn't much to build," he said, "mostly keeping things from falling apart. That's still building." He looked up, surprised at her tone. There was no softness in it, but no bitterness, either, just the way someone spoke of weather they'd learned to live with. By midday, the heat was close enough to taste. They stopped at the dry well where the rope lay curled, half buried in dust. Aiyana dropped to one knee and touched the ground beside the stones. "They came here," she said. Elias followed her gaze. 2 bootprints, faint but fresh, pressed deep where the soil held more salt than sand. One smaller, one wide. The edges were still sharp. Whoever had stood there hadn't drawn water, just watched. He looked toward the ridge. The silence was wrong, too, even. No birds, no wind. "They're close," he said. She rose slowly. "You think they'll come back?" "They always do," he said. "They just wait until the light turns soft enough to hide behind." Aiyana reached into the well's mouth, pulling up the rope to test it. It held. "Then we work faster." When they returned to the cabin, Elias built a new shutter for the west window. Aiyana gathered dry mesquite branches, breaking them into neat bundles. She didn't ask what he planned. She moved as if she already knew. The quiet between them wasn't empty now. It had weight rhythm. Inside, she swept the floor again, not because it needed it, but because it gave her hands a reason to keep moving. Elias watched from the porch, saw how she paused to trace the crack in the wall with her fingers, how she adjusted a loose nail with the heel of her palm. She had rebuilt something small in herself without asking permission. He found himself saying, "You could leave if you wanted." She didn't look up. "You could too. That's different." "Is it?" Her words hung there, soft but heavy enough to stay. Later, as the sun began to lower, Elias cut open a sack of cornmeal and mixed it with water in a dented bowl. The smell of ash clung to everything. Aiyana sat outside, braiding a strip of cloth from her torn dress, her fingers moving steady despite the stiffness in her shoulder. "You ever fix things that don't stay fixed?" he asked from the doorway. "All the time," she said. "But sometimes the fixing is the part that matters." He half smiled at that. "You talk like a preacher." "My people talk like the earth," she said. "We don't need to be right, only true." The words quieted him. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and a thin line of orange split the valley. Elias finished hammering the last board into place, wiped his hands on his pants, and stepped back. Aiyana came to stand beside him, holding a bucket she had mended with twine. "You walked all the way to the creek for that?" he asked. She nodded once. "Water makes places remember themselves." He looked at her, at the red dust on her dress, the dried blood along the seam of her bandage. "You shouldn't be hauling weight like that. I carried worse." There was no challenge in her tone, just memory. She set the bucket down carefully, then added, "It helps not to think." About what? About what still waits out there. They ate in silence that evening. The sky turned violet, the kind of color that makes you remember it's been a long time since you've seen beauty without fear. Aiyana sat by the door, hair loose, now the revolver resting near her knee. Elias poured the last of the coffee, thin and bitter, and sat across from her. "You're not afraid?" he asked. She shook her head. "I've already lost the thing they want to take." "What's that, my place?" He looked around the cabin, one bed, one chair walls, patched from leftover timber. "Then this is yours as much as mine." Aiyana smiled faintly, only at the corner of her mouth. "We'll see if the land agrees." As the fire dropped to embers, Elias checked the rifle by habit. He cleaned the chamber slow and methodical. Aiyana watched him from across the table, then spoke quiet but firm. "They'll come before the moon is full." He nodded. "I know. They'll think you're alone." "I'm used to that." She tilted her head, eyes catching the orange flicker of the stove. "You're not." He met her gaze long enough to see the steadiness behind it, the kind that came from someone who had run out of ways to bow. Outside, the first stars blinked awake. The land was too still again. Elias stood, looked out the window. "When the dust moves, don't wait for me to tell you. Just move." "I don't run," she said again. He almost smiled. "Then don't miss." When he turned back, she was holding something in her hand, a small strip of cloth, rough stitches forming the start of a word. Only 2 letters, finished H and O. She looked embarrassed when she saw him notice. "It keeps my hand steady," she said. "What were you sewing? I don't know yet." "Maybe something that means stay." He nodded once. "Then keep at it." That night, the wind returned low and restless, threading through the cracks like a warning. Elias lay on the floor, rifle across his chest, watching the flames draw thin shapes on the ceiling. He listened to her breathing, steady and near. Then faintly came the sound he dreaded most. Not thunder, not wind, but the dry clap of hooves somewhere beyond the ridge. Not 1 horse. 3. Slow. Measured. He sat up, met her eyes in the dim light. She was already awake, hand on the revolver. "They're here," he said. She didn't blink. "Then we wait for the color to change." The wind shifted again, bringing with it the smell of iron and dust, and the distant echo of men who thought the night belonged to them. The basin wore noon, the way a man wears a borrowed coat, ill-fitting, impatient. Light hammered the yard flat, and every nail head on the porch threw a small, mean sun of its own. Elias shaded his eyes with the heel of his hand and tasted grit. Aiyana stood just inside, behind the stove's iron belly, where she could see him through the door's split 2 inches of world enough. He said, "If they come, they'll come neat. How do you know men who hunt in daylight, like the look of themselves?" She said nothing, but her breath thinned the way a thread pulls under a needle. Hoofbeats. Crisp measured a cadence that had learned to sound casual. 2 riders stepped out of the heat, Shimmer the first in a clean hat and tidy mustache, Sheriff Lyle, who wore law like a coat lined with receipts. The second had a face the sun had spoiled, and a smile that remembered old debts, Samuel Pike. Elias felt the name lock his jaw without asking permission. He didn't reach for the rifle. He leaned his shoulder on the doorframe and let the heat do the humming. Morning, Mercer Lyle called as if he delivered it. Afternoon, Elias said, because it was. Pike grinned. Always particular with your time. Good to see you upright. Likewise, Elias said. It wasn't. Lyle reined in at the well. He looked over the fence lines, the patched shutter, the bucket Aiyana had mended, saw more than he wanted to admit. Heard tell you had company, he said mildly. The sort folks spend coin to be rid of. Company comes and goes, Elias said. Sometimes Pike put in company gets a man into old habits, charity, for example. You were good at charity back when it cost other people. Elias didn't smile. He watched the dust move around their horses' knees. He said, name your business. Lyle lifted a folded paper and smoothed it with 2 fingers the way he might smooth a bill of sale. The serif on top was fat with importance. Wanted, he read polite as a clerk. Female Apache called Aiyana. Suspected arson. He let the word sit and sulk. Reward $500 for information or delivery. Inside, Aiyana didn't move. Elias could feel her not moving like a heat signature. He kept his gaze on Lyle. Arson's a big word for a little woman. Fire's big even in small hands, Lyle said. She burned a map, so the rumor goes. Railroad men don't like their straight lines soured. They prefer to cross what they please. Bones, too. Pike shifted in the saddle, smile pared down. Ain't our place to argue where a line wants to go? His eyes slid to the rope behind the cabin where a washed scrap of deerskin fluttered. But it is our place to keep folks cooperative. We pay for cooperation. You mean you buy it? Elias said. Pike's smile died completely. Lyle's never did. Word buys peace, the sheriff said. Peace buys progress. Elias let his eyes wander over the horizon like he cared about the weather. Progress keeps its own books, he said. What do you want here that you couldn't get from a saloon mouth? Truth, Lyle said. We'll pay for it. Truth doesn't sell well out here, Elias said. Too heavy for the cart. Pike leaned forward on his horn, all friendly again, like he was trying on an old jacket. Mercer, I dragged you off a field in the San Juan when men were dying in their own smoke. You owe me and I ain't collected. Elias stared at him until the space between them remembered the weight of that day and how both men had nearly made their last promises. Debts paid, he said. I kept you from killing a boy who surrendered. Pike's mouth twitched, then hardened. I remember your sermons. He turned his horse a half step and nodded at the open door. So, you got anything you want to tell the sheriff? Aiyana's fingers closed around the revolver's grip. She stayed in the seam of shade. Elias didn't turn his head. I got beans, a broke plow, and a fence that needs 2 more days you don't have. He lifted a hand at the yard. If you want to help fetch nails. Pike laughed, once a sound that had learned to cut on the way out. Lyle didn't laugh. He unfolded the poster fully and held it out at arm's length so the ink could meet the sun. The number burned black and simple. 500 buys a lot of nails, he said gently. Buys a new life, some say. Or buys a man out of the one he ought to keep, Elias said. The sheriff let the paper droop. We aren't asking for a sin. We're asking for cooperation. Folks get hurt when men feel bigger than the law. And when the law feels bigger than bone, Elias said. Lyle guided his horse closer to the porch, stopping where a man on foot could reach and a man in the saddle could bolt. It was an old trick, dressed like a courtesy. He lowered his voice, as if letting Elias in on something smart. You didn't start this, he said. You don't have to finish it. If she's here, we'll come back with a warrant. And that'll be bad for everybody. Save the trouble. Point us to her or don't. But think on the math. He tapped the poster. This says a life. Yours. Pike's grin returned in a smaller, crueler shape. 500, he said. Your soul ain't cost less. Elias looked past them into the white. He had been poorer than this offer on winter nights, when the wind spent him down to bone. He had watched men add up their lives in coin and drink and women, and come up short anyway. He said, There's water in the well if you're thirsty. Lyle studied him one more breath, then folded the poster with neat care and slid it into his vest. We'll be back, he said. I counted on it, Elias said. Pike lingered. Mercer, he said soft, you think you're better than what's coming. You're not. You're a slow man in a fast land, and it'll run you flat. Only if I lie down, Elias said. Pike's gaze shifted past Elias and found with the greed of a hawk the smallest betrayal a yard can make, a bead of blue glass caught on a nail-head by the window part of the string Aiyana had found and hung. His eyes bright. He didn't point, but he didn't have to. He clicked his tongue, turned his horse, and rode out slow signal enough. They left a careful dust behind them. Elias watched until both men were small enough to fit into a lie. He stepped inside and shut the door. The room seemed to inhale. Aiyana came out from behind the stove, chin-up eyes, not asking permission to be fierce. That one, she said. Pike. He is the bullet you didn't pull. Elias leaned his palms on the table and let the wood take some weight. He thinks I owe him, he said. Aiyana's mouth edged toward something that wasn't a smile and wasn't mercy. He owes the ground, she said. He will pay it. Elias reached for the poster he hadn't taken. He found it anyway, wedged where a boot had dragged it free from Lyle's stack, stuck between porch boards, like a sin that wanted to be found. He brought it inside and laid it on the table. The seraph curled at the corners, smug. He read it through once slow, as if speed could be a kind of surrender. He turned it toward her. They made your name right, he said. She didn't touch it. They burn letters cleaner than land. He slid the paper into the stove and fed it to the small waiting fire. The number went last a dark mouth that refused to swallow until the heat convinced it. He went to the shelf, lifted a floorboard with his knife, and took out the short shotgun he had promised to forget. He set it beside the revolver and the box of cartridges. "You don't have to kill a man to stop him," he said, "but you do have to aim like you mean it." Aiyana nodded, then crossed to the door and set her palm on the jamb the way she had the night before, a greeting acclaim. When she asked, "Dusk," he said. "Men like Lyle promised to come tomorrow, and Pike comes tonight. We make ready." They did. In the next hour the cabin became smaller in a way that made it stronger. Elias drove a second brace across the west window, iron nails seated deep. Aiyana packed the cracks with clay and tallow. He set a lantern on the table and left it unlit. She filled 2 cups and left them at opposite ends of the room, as if thirst could be persuaded not to pick sides. When the light began to tilt, Elias showed her the escape hole he dug beneath the back wall, low, narrow, hidden by a loose board that didn't look loose. "If I fall," he said, "you crawl." She looked at the dark gap, then back at him. "If you fall," she said, "I stand." He didn't argue. Some promises are stronger because they're impossible. From the far ridge, a hat moved where a man had no business at sunset. Then another hat. Then the glint of something the color of appointments, a badge or a buckle catching the last of the light and turning it mean. Aiyana lifted the shotgun, felt its wrong weight settle into a right place. Elias checked the rifle, then laid it down and put his hand on the door, not to open it but to feel the knocks when they came. 3 raps, he said, gentle, like a teacher about to lie. Aiyana's gaze went to the bead string above the window, blue and bone, turned dull in the dusk. "I'll count," she said. Outside the horses circled slow, patient as men with time and coin. Inside the fire drew small and stubborn, a heart refusing to stop. The first rap landed soft, familiar. The second followed polite as a favor. The third came, and with it a voice Pike made warm as whiskey. "Even in Farmer, we brought a friend and a paper." A pause. Then softer, "We came to collect your better judgment." Aiyana's finger found the trigger's curve. Elias's palm stayed on the door. "Not tonight," he said, to the wood and the air and the men beyond it. A silence opened, thin, high, the kind that breaks. Then something heavier than a man's hand thumped against the rear wall, not at the door at all. They split. Aiyana whispered. Elias's eyes cut to the back window. "They're already in position." And the porch boards, remembering men who love their own rhythm, tightened for the next sound. The desert didn't forget, but it softened. After the fire and gunpowder, after the graves were filled, and the tools set back on their hooks, the basin returned to the only rhythm it knew, wind dust and the patient sound of 2 people learning how to stay. Days folded into one another, slow as breath. The air was sharp at dawn and dry by noon. The smell of ash never fully left the walls, though Aiyana said it kept the bad spirits from circling back. Elias didn't argue. "Some things you let be true because they help you stand upright." His shoulder healed wrong tight in the mornings. The skin along his ribs pulled like wire. He worked slower, but he still worked, mending fences, digging a new trench where the rain might one day come. Aiyana followed her own quiet tasks, grinding mesquite pods, patching what the bullets had split, sweeping the same stretch of floor she'd already cleaned. Routine became a kind of prayer. When the light fell right through the slats, the house looked less like ruin. The smoke stains turned gold. The broken rifle on the wall glinted like something honest instead of dead. She'd begun sewing again. The same scrap of cloth she'd started before the shooting now held 4 uneven letters, home. The word sat crooked, tilted, like the land itself. When she asked for a nail to hang it, Elias just nodded. She drove it into the wall above the window, careful, like she was putting up a charm. The fabric fluttered each time the wind passed, soft and stubborn, a small flag of survival. He noticed she hummed now while she worked. The tune wasn't something he knew, not quite melody, not quite morning. It threaded through the house, made it feel occupied in a way silence never had. He'd stop sometimes just to listen, pretending he needed to check the stove or the water barrel. He never said so, but her hum made the air gentle again. One afternoon they rode into Dry Hollow together for the first time. The road there was long, cracked with old wagon tracks. The mule was slow but steady. Aiyana rode beside him, not behind. Her braid was tied high, catching dust, like it wanted to prove something to the sun. Elias felt the town before he saw it, the metallic tang of iron, the echo of hammers from the blacksmiths, the smell of people living close enough to forget the sky. When they entered, the main street heads turned. A man sweeping his porch paused mid-motion. A woman at the well stopped drawing water. Even the horses lifted their heads.